Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm BorbalaFellegi speaking from Budapest, Hungary. Let me thank for the invitation to Dr. Dobrinka Chankova for being able to speak at this wonderful conference. Let me say that I feel deep respect towards Dobrinka's work since 2004, since I've seen her activities in implementing restorative justice in Sofia, in Bulgaria, and beyond Bulgaria within the European context. And I think that her commitment and passion is remarkable in the whole European international field. And I really wish her and her organization and your conference to see the positive impact of these steps. I really like the title of this event, Rethinking Crime and Punishment. I think it's really time to rethink crime and punishment, and even more, to rethink conflicts in our contemporary global world. Coming from Hungary as a Hungarian citizen, right after our general elections, I see how the European basic democratic principles and values of humane justice system and of humane treat of each other might be questioned by our citizen fellows. And I think that this is the best time to think about how we can have constructive conflict resolution discussions, conversations that can help us to understand what's happening in our world and how to move on in a more constructive and peaceful way. In the following, let me show you some slides that I've prepared as a part of my presentation. I will talk about a little bit how mediation and restorative justice shows its results in the Hungarian system after 10 years of implementation. We can say that our mediation system now is based on the probation service run by specifically trained probation mediation officers. And in the last 10 years, we had almost 50,000 penal mediation cases. And I think this is a great result. Mediation in penal matters can be offered both for young and adult offenders for crimes that are not punishable with more than 5 years of prison sentence. Both prosecutors and the judges, and recently even the police, can refer cases to mediation. And if it's in the case of young offenders, the cases are closed if the mediation are successful, while for adults, between 3 and 5 years of imprisonment, the case goes to the court and the judge can decide how he or she mitigates the sentence based on the mediation result. Based on some research results, we have an 85% agreement rate, and out of the agreements, 90% of the agreements are indeed fulfilled by these offenders. So I think we have to see that this can be a very successful way of dealing with crimes. And just one piece of data from 2004, what I've seen that 1.5 million euro financial compensation has been paid directly from offenders to victims through such mediations. And we also have to think about the symbolic reparation that is often offered through these mediations. However, we have certainly the main questions around the organizational structure, how the capacities can be broadened of the mediators, how we can provide their ongoing training and supervision, and how we can broaden the scope of the cases that can be referred for mediation. I would also like to say that in our society, penal mediation is only one part of all the conflicts that we can see, and how important is that restorative practices are applied, first of all, in crime prevention, in the culture of conflict management, in our communities, families, schools, working environment. Of course, when there are certain more serious conflicts that can lead to the criminal court, at this phase, the prosecutor can refer the case to mediation, and that can divert the case from the formal procedure. In more serious cases, the state can say and the court can say that we can't divert the case, but we can combine court sanctioning procedure together with restorative practices, and it is also very important so that the victims' points and interests are considered. And we should not forget that at the incapacitation at the prison level, it is also very important to think about how inmates, how their relatives, their family members, how victims of offenders who are imprisoned can meet at certain points if there are voluntary willingness for that, and how we can talk about, for example, the issues of prison release. My organization, 4C Research Group, has been running projects on all these levels regarding peacemaking circle projects and also community level restorative justice projects. And recently we are running a radicalization prevention project at the prison system. I also would like to say at this moment, as I mentioned in my introduction, that restorative justice is not only valid regarding crime and penal procedures. It is more and more questioned when we talk about the societal issues, social justice, and general conflicts within our societies. In that regard, it's important to think that and know and be aware that restorative practices can be very well used and should be used mainly in our informal way of life, how we communicate with our colleagues, with our friends, with our school teachers, how children learn these techniques in their kindergartens, in their schools, regarding the use of I statements, affective statements, how we can talk about need and strengths-based level instead of blaming each other, for example. It's very important, and we see, for example, in organizations or also in schools, that thematic circles can be very, very good preventative ways of building community when we ask people to sit around the team and share that team and their views and their feelings, their thoughts regarding one team without having any conflict. Of course, when we see that some conflicts arise, it's important to use mediation and clarifying circles, and as the most formal techniques, peacemaking circles, conferences can be applied. But it's important that those reactive methods are only just minority of all the practices that we can use as preventative, proactive techniques. Let me a little bit talk about my context, Hungary. As you can see on this little guy, one technique that we unfortunately got used to, and it's a still very ongoing strategy, is to stay silent when we feel conflicts around us. There is a history for that. Our post-dictatorship society, knowing all the history of the 20th century and before, we know, and unfortunately we have this heritage of stay silent and not to talk about conflicts when we feel and see them. But we also know that avoidance and silence cannot be sustained for a long time. As this graph shows, if we are constantly sweeping our frustrations under the rug without actually talking it through, sooner or later we will either fall or we are going to need a bigger rug. In any case, for me as a Hungarian, this is a key question, how we shift and help people and motivate people to talk about their frustrations and sorrow when this is very difficult and often very frightening. Working in communities and with a lot of citizens with mediation and peacemaking circles and conferencing, we see that one step that we can have in this, what I would call a dialogue process, dialogue level pyramid, is storytelling. When you just go and approach and ask people just about their life story, their history, without actually questioning or interrupting or judging them. Because storytelling and life history sharing is one of the main aspects that can help us in actually reflect. Who are we? Those things that happened to me in my childhood, how has that impacted my presence? And how will that impact my future choices? I think this kind of awareness and recognition and reflection of our own stories can have a great impact on how we reflect on our identity as an individual and as community. And that kind of space might allow me to actually listen to the other side. And that kind of openness and listening and unjudgmental safe spaces can lead actually to dialogue that we talk about in restorative practices. And this is the condition of actually thinking about any kind of reconciliation. So this is a process and it has many steps. And what I want to say at this moment is that it might take a lot of energy and long time. Sometimes we go through this process within 5 minutes in a scenario, but sometimes it takes years and sometimes it takes generations to be able to tell my story, to reflect what my ancestors have done, and to be able to listen another story from another perspective. Furthermore, I would like to again stress that it's so important that we as mediators actually listen and acknowledge what has been put into that story in a non-judgmental way, non-interrupted way, and trying to find the beauty within every shared story, even if some of the elements we might not agree with or find that different from ours. Finally, let me share one case that was very, very important to me as a mediator and facilitator in a peacemaking circle. When I was facilitating a circle between two young adults who were, by the way, university students, who drew swastika on posters of a street photo exhibition of Down syndrome children. So, for example, here you can see one boy, Gergő, who is 17 years old, and you could have seen beautiful photos of such boys and girls in the street, sharing one quote by them. For example, here Gergő says, "I accept everyone as he or she is. I hope you accept me as I am as well. Do you?" So you can imagine a pedestrian street with such big photos, and these two university students drew swastika and other rage symbols on these, some of them. You could have had a prosecution and a criminal case, and there was a criminal case referred by the prosecutor, but the idea was that instead of just punishing them and sending them, sanctioning them, and legally representing the association that organized the exhibition, what if we make a circle with all these people, sit down in a circle together with the two university students, their supporters, the probation officer, and also all these children who have been seriously harmed by this act. As the discussion went, it was very striking and interesting to see how the students, the offenders, actually shared. They never thought of what their stupid act can cause on others. And it was just really a depressive time for them. They used drugs and alcohol. They were in a depressive state of their mind. They were righteous during those days, and that the expression of their rage were these actual graffitis. But they never thought that they do such harm for families and young people like Gergő. So Gergő saw how these university students actually cried, and in the middle of the circle, he stepped to the offender girl and he told to her very slowly, because he hardly could speak, that "I don't want you to cry because of me," and he hugged her. And that was a very touching moment for me to see how actually reconciliation and peace can be done if we allow people to approach each other and feel each other's emotions without defensiveness. And as a consequence, they all agreed that they would pay, of course, the reparation of the posters, but also the offenders offered a workshop at their university in front of their peers, and they shared the story, what they learned from this case, what they learned from this act, and how this act and these Down syndrome families actually opened their eyes up towards the real values of life. So I would say that restoration could happen not only on the level of victims and offenders, but also on the level of community. And this is what I believe, that when there is harm, the reason is always that there is an unmet need, and behind any need there is a human being. And we have, you as mediators, as practitioners, as social workers, as educators, you have the ability to hear these stories and listen to these stories and share these stories. And I believe that storytelling and listening are keys to these humans. And maybe the steps we can take day by day is very, very small. We should not underestimate their value. But what I see is that each step can be very helpful to recover from previous trauma and find ways for reconciliation and be able to move on in our lives. So I would like to thank everyone for your attention and for following me with this line of thoughts. And I would like to wish you a wonderful seminar and a wonderful joint thinking on how we can rethink crime and punishment and conflicts and peace in our societies. Thank you very much for your attention.